What I want to try to do now is kind of focus on a little bit. Up till now, we've kind of been looking at the planning mode. Maybe we'll talk just a little bit about what you might do if you're looking at, now you're actually in the season. So I don't know, I kind of have this little art here. You know, this is what the weatherman told you it was going to be, cool, cloudy, and snow. And you know, instead of that, we've got, you know, we need an air conditioner going. I mean, that's about how good we are at predicting these things these days. You know, we commented here in the hall a while back, about 2 years ago, every extension meeting I went to, all I heard was, Lake McConaughey will never fill again. Well, of course, we missed that big time, right? So we don't know what's going to come down the road in the future. So our plans are based on the most likely thing to happen, but we know that in real life, that's not going to be what occurs. And so we'll talk a little bit about of kind of some rules of thumb that we have here maybe that you might think about for how do I deviate from my plan if this year turns out to be a lot wetter or drier, or crop values change as we go through this setting. Planning versus implementing here, you know, plans are based on our best estimate of what's likely to happen, and you know, statistics will show you that the best estimate of what's going to happen in the future is going to be what's happened in the past historically. During the actual season, of course, precipitation, crop water use, crop values can change. And so we ask that question, how should you adapt then to what's going on in this particular year? And this answer is going to depend on the type of allocation program you have, and it's going to depend on that expected prices that you have out there for that commodity. You know, a year ago, I was in a lot of extension meetings, and the forecast then was, you know, a reasonably expectable price for corn was going to be somewhere in that $4.25 range. A year ago. Well, we didn't get that any better than we did Lake McConaughey, did we? So these prices are uncertain, and we don't know them ahead of time. So I'm going to start with kind of the simplest type of allocation program that we look at. And that's where I have a single season allocation, and I cannot trade that water back and forth. So I have to put the water that I have on the pivot, I'm going to say a pivot, for that year, and I can't carry it over. And I can't sell it, I can't do anything with it. Either I use it or lose it in that particular year. So what would you do if it's going to be drier than normal? You're for sure going to use the water that you have. I mean, you're for sure going to use all of the water that you have in the allocation. You planned on using more of that water. Planned on being able to irrigate a little bit more land area because you thought you were going to have more water than what you really had in total when you look at rainfall and precipitation together. So you're definitely going to use the water in that case. You're going to emphasize, I think, as Gary pointed out earlier, you're going to emphasize irrigating near the critical growth stage, a little bit what we called water miser earlier. You're going to focus on that tasseling time period. Probably not going to change irrigated area because you've already invested, by that time, you've already invested in seed fertilizer and all these things. And actually, folks, what we find is that there's a fairly wide plateau of net return. If I vary irrigated land area a little bit, and I'm down where I do have some stress, if I vary my irrigated land a little bit, it of course affects how much water you can put on, and those kind of offset each other. So you kind of lay in a relatively flat plateau out there where you could make a fairly wide variation on irrigated land, and it doesn't really affect your net return all that much. So it's not like you're sitting on the edge of the cliff and I happen to irrigate 2 acres too many and I'm going to fall off the cliff. So what we see anyway is in that case, if I have a little more land area than would have been optimal had it stayed as wet as I thought it was, you still irrigate that area, put a little less on, and your net return is not going to be a lot different than if you had exactly the right land area. When I look at a wet year, what would you do in a wet year? Okay, you know, I think I'm going to apply the water up to the point that we reach that point what we call marginal return equals marginal cost. If it's really a wet year, I'm going to apply irrigation water up to the point where if I put another unit of water on and it costs me more to pump it than I'm going to get back in crop yield, then I'm not going to do that. But if I have enough water to get up to that maximum net return level, I'm just going to irrigate till I hit maximum net return. As a practical matter, what that really means here is in B then, really means that you're going to try to irrigate for pretty close to that full yield, that maximum net return when land is now limiting and water is not limiting. You're probably going to be pretty close to getting to full yield. You know, we're going to want a good soil water monitoring program, irrigation scheduling, so I don't waste that water. I mean, no sense pumping it if it's not doing me any good. But I think that's going to be your objective in a single season when it's wetter than normal, wetter than you'd planned for. Obviously, if you could sell or trade the water up to a point, then you would want to look at what that sales price would be and look at what your returns are. Of course, when it's a wetter than normal year, there aren't all that many buyers out there buying water. So this may not be the strongest alternative there in Part D. So that's kind of my view. I don't have an equation here for you to calculate this, but I think this one just kind of is common sense. If I can't do anything else with the water, I'm going to use it as long as it doesn't cost me more to use it than what I'm going to get back out of it. And so I think that's a relatively simple concept. The challenge comes in these ones where you have some other options. And so the first one I wanted to take a look at is, what if we have multiple fields in a single year? So we're back to the trading option here that Dr. Sapala just talked about. The way I would summarize what those results showed is that in times of shortage, what you would do is you shift water from less efficient systems to the more efficient systems, or you shift water from those systems that cost a lot more to pump the water to those systems that are cheaper to pump the water. I'm going to be able to use the water, so I'm going to go to where I get the most bang for my buck in terms of yield, or it costs me less to pump. If you have a situation where you're going to shift that water then to those more efficient systems up to the point where now the efficient system gets close to its maximum yield, maximum return. And so at that point, then you're going to go to your next best alternative and pivot if you have multiple systems, and you're going to put more water towards those better systems. So again, on our best systems, I think we're going to be probably irrigating up there closer to full yield on those systems, and we're going to take our hit on the dry year on that system that is not very efficient, where it costs me a lot to pump it, or the amount of water I get converted from pumpage to ET is smaller. What would I do in a wet year? Well, in a wet year, I'm going to be able to fully irrigate more systems. So now what happens is my efficient pivot reaches its maximum net return point for a lot less water. So then I'm going to shift that water off that efficient pivot. I'm going to put it on that inefficient pivot that wouldn't get to maximum net return if I didn't have some extra water. So, I think those two that's fairly easy to see what you do there. You don't have the option of carrying this water over to another year, so you're going to use it on the most efficient systems where you get the biggest bang for the buck, and it's the cheapest water first, and then work down the list. Investing in improvements and efficiency on poor fields. If you can trade the water and you're short of water, so if I had 5 systems like we looked at in this last example that Dr. Sapala went through, if I could trade water from the least efficient pivot and put it on the more efficient pivot, and I'm in at a tight enough water supply that, I use up a lot of my water supply in that, it's really hard to see how I could justify putting money into that old pivot out there that's maybe not as efficient. If our shortages are not that severe, now then you got some more change here that you could invest in improving that system. And I think that's what Dr. Sapala was talking about. You reach the peak there in the middle of that net return curve. You don't reach it on either end of the water supply. So I don't know, that's kind of my summary of multiple fields and this idea of trading water. You're going to take the water where it gives you the maximum bang for its buck. The most complicated system here, well, next to most complicated system, is if I have a single field and I have multiple year allocation. So now I'm in a program where I have a water supply maybe over a 5-year period, and I have one well that I'm going to use that water on. I call this, the last one I called a trading experience. This one I think it's a carry forward opportunity. If I can carry that water from this year into the next, maybe I can get more value out of it down the road. And the really foggy part here, folks, is what you're really trying to do is you're trying to balance the value of the water this year versus what the value of the remaining water supply would be in the next few years. If I could use the water this year and it's more valuable than I expect it to be over the next 2 or 3 years of my allocation program, I'm going to use it now. On the other hand, if this is a year where crop prices aren't very good, I don't need much water, maybe I'm going to not irrigate that much this year, hoping that I'm going to have a better payout down the road. You really am looking at that question, and they're saying, what's my long-term expectations of return versus in the future versus this year? And both of these are as difficult to predict as you can imagine. We just can't see down the future far enough to know what those are going to be. So there's uncertainty here in all of this. So we kind of look at this, my answer to this is going to be a much more general kind of thing. So factors we have to consider is the rainfall this season compared to normal. So you're going to have a good rain gauge out there, and you're going to have to know what you would normally be expecting to get for rainfall in your location. And we think you need to make irrigation adjustments compared to what your average long-term expectation of rainfall was. And commodity prices are going to be important to you here as we change these, as things change in an unexpected way. We've worn this thing out. What we've shown here, of course, is that we have this yield ET line. And so this amount of yield that we get here when we don't irrigate, we didn't put any water on, but we had some evapotranspiration. So where did that water come from? I didn't irrigate. Where's the evapotranspiration come from for that water? Soil moisture, that's one spot. And effective precipitation is the other. So the way we tend to try to think about this is, we add one more graph, and I know that's what you're dying to see, one more of these here, but we look at this, and instead of looking at just irrigation or rainfall in the bottom, we look along the bottom here as what we call a field water supply. Now this is a concept actually that we borrow from some people out in California back in the 70s. Stewart and Hagen were amongst the first people to draw this diagram. But so what their point is that when we look at this non-irrigated yield for our irrigated corn, for example, we achieve that yield, that evapotranspiration. We still have a linear yield ET line, but that production comes from effective precipitation or stored soil water that we can mine out of the soil during the growing season. Hopefully Mother Nature is going to fill it back up here, but that's yet to be seen. If this was an average year that we were planning on, let's suppose, or maybe a wetter year. I think I've got a graph here the next. So let's suppose we have the wet year and we have our graph here. How is this figure going to change in a drier year? What are you going to get for dry land yields in a drier year? They're going to go down, aren't they? Okay. How much ET am I going to be able to extract out of the soil and precipitation? It's going to go down, isn't it? So we have this curve setting up here. In a wet year, I think in a drier year, I think that curve simply shifts down and to the left. That makes sense? In a lot of ways, what we're really doing, the reason this curve shifted is that the precipitation is less than we expected. Maybe my stored soil water, there was a question earlier about that, maybe my stored soil water is a little below what I thought it was going to be. So now, in order to get to this maximum yield, I can still get to maximum yield up here, but it's going to take me more irrigation water to do it, isn't it? If I don't know if I can back up here or not, if we look at this, what our goal was is we calculated this maximum average net return across this line. And when we do that on this next one, we're going to calculate it across that same line. And so the slopes of those optimal average net returns are not going to be a whole lot different between those two alternatives. What we're really kind of recommending then for you to think about for guidelines for multiple years in a single field, you got to keep track of that rainfall and know whether you're getting ahead or behind. You're going to irrigate to achieve about the same yield as you had in planting. So, if you came out of this and your yield, your optimal yield was, say, 195 bushel of corn instead of 210, what we're saying here is probably need to try to achieve about 195 bushel of corn again. You're not going to irrigate for maximum yield, but maybe you still need to be around that 195 bushel of corn that was your goal. So if you're 2 inches less in rainfall, then you use some of the water that you might be able to use in the next year. You instead of carrying forward, you borrow backward that of the water supply and put it into this year. In a wet year, I'm going to apply less, and I'm going to carry water back then in time. Hopefully next year, that water is going to be more valuable to me. So we're really recommending that you take what you get from this planting mode, you look at how much rainfall we're thinking about in that location, and then you simply are going to irrigate more or less based upon whether this year is wetter or drier than that previous year. What would you do in the last year of the program? If you were in a 5-year allocation, what would you do in the last year of that allocation? If I can't carry that water forward to the next 5 years, I'm probably going to use it this year, to whatever extent that I can. Now, you're never going to irrigate to the point that you exceed the, where it's costing you more to pump than you're going to get out of it. You don't just use it just to use it. It's got to be producing some benefit. But I think if you're in the last year of the program, you're probably going to use that supply up. Now, some of the NRDs allow you to carry over the unused water. I know the Upper Republican has had a long time history of doing that. Other places are not doing that, so this becomes very much a local local point of view. What if the prices changed? Let's think about this year. Suppose you'd went in with a plan to, I don't know, suppose you went in with a plan you were going to put on 10 inches of water. I think this time last year your plan would have been based on what price for commodities, for corn? $4.50 a bushel, maybe something like that. Well, what are we at this summer? You know, if you didn't already sell it at 4.5, and I know none of you guys did that. Ford contracted at 4.5, but you know, if you could sell that at $7 now, what would you do with the water this year? You would use it this year, wouldn't you? It was dry. It's going to give me a high return. I've got a lot of dollars that are probably above expected dollar return. So clearly, if your value goes way up, during the year, you're going to tend to shift water into this year. How much you shift, that one's a little bit harder to predict. But as Dr. Sabala just showed, that net return for $7 versus 4.5 is huge. You may borrow a lot of water this year if you can borrow that forward. And you know, so in 212 prices, kind of on that last number 7 bullet there, you know, we saw a price run up on corn of at least $3 a bushel, didn't we? Right at that, and you know, that's just going to encourage you to probably use it now. There was once a time when we would tell you that you need to think about, you know, what's the opportunity value of your money, looking at interest rates and looking at what rates of return that you could expect. But with the interest rates where they're out there today, you know, those are almost meaningless. So we're not even really including a discounting rate of any significance into our calculation for these multi-year systems now. If you were back in the 70s where we had 22% or 20% interest rates, that would be a different story. But right now with low interest rates, we don't think that discounting is not worth the time you spend to do the calculation.